It's been the topic of conversation all morning long, the Quebec provincial budget, and we're going to break it down. We have some special guests joining us in studio. Starting to my left, we have, of course, Philippe Gohier, managing editor at L'Actualité. Phil, welcome back to the show. Great to have you here. And Paul Brunet, he is the chairman and CEO of the Council for the Protection of Patients. Welcome, Paul. And, of course, my colleague, Elias Makos. Let's first of all go around the panel. We'll start with you, Paul. Maybe give us your overall grade. How would you grade the budget?
Well, we have a problem. Just to lever the system, we need at least 3% raise. We're getting 1.7. That signifies that we need another $1 billion cut in the coming months. So it's not looking good for just maintaining what we already have with all the lacks that we've been observing as we speak now.
Phil, how about yourself?
I think as a declaration of sort of political intent, it's still a bit opaque. We don't really have an idea where this government wants to go and what it wants to do in the coming years, right? Most of the extra money that was saved from the last few years of cutbacks went straight to the debt, went straight to the Fonds des Générations. And so as far as getting a clearer idea of what this government wants to do, what it wants to prioritize, I mean, it can talk about education, it can talk about a bunch of things, but it's not actually delivering on those things. So it's unclear.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, guys. I look at this budget, I seem to like the fact that it seems like the government wants to make sure that we are leaving the financial books in a better situation for the next generation. Obviously, some things are hurting, especially like hospitals. We had a story earlier this week where the Jewish General Hospital is cutting beds starting next month. So how do you think the government is doing at that balancing act?
We're not going to be able to balance the budget without having these sacrifices that we've been talking about for the past months, if not years. What is sad is that the great new MUHC hospital is already closing beds. I mean, we have brand new units that will not be used because we don't have the budgets to maintain and operate it. That's pretty awkward, and it's unfortunate, and this is one of many examples for which that we're still claiming some more efforts from the government.
On that, Paul, do you think phasing out the health tax was a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, listen, they had promised they would cut it. Now they're cutting it in half. So it's a political promise, and we've been certainly observing all these promises for the past 40 years that we've been in the business here at our association. And still, we know the promises, but in reality, certainly it's different when you have to govern and decide of a given budget. But in terms of health matters, of course, we're not even close of what we're needing right now.
You're giving it a failing grade on health matters?
Unfortunately. I know the state is broke.
Right.
But why not telling us that we're not going to get what we need and what people are trying to get because of their health situation? We have elderlies that are crying out loud for home care service. It is not delivered, and that is a problem. We get even more complaints than ever.
The other big issue, the most funds going $1.2 billion over a three-year period into education. Phil, what did you think about that? Because we talked a little bit earlier, and you said perhaps a little smoke and mirrors on this.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely a much more modest investment than what the government is making it out to be. I mean, for one thing, they campaigned on increasing the education budget by 3.5% per year. And now they're touting a 3% investment in education as being a massive reinvestment into the system. The truth is that education is consistently something that ranks it's below inflation. Whatever money gets put into it is often below inflation and has been for several years now. So I mean, a massive reinvestment in education would not be a 3% boost. It would be a 4, 5, 6% boost in education. So I don't think it's fair to paint this as a truly as a signifier of intent, right? That they intend to boost education funding in the province.
Certainly a shame that we're seeing 700. Not in the perspective of we should have been probably working on it for a long period of time, but $700 million going to infrastructure alone to help repair crumbling schools.
Also interesting is that the Quebec government saying, hey, we also need some help from the federal government. They want to see those dollars. So it'll be interesting to see how the news we get from Ottawa next week work with what the Quebec wants to do.
But if we look at the school infrastructure, for example, right, you've got 79% of schools within the Montreal School Board that are classified E, right, which is a failing grade for infrastructure.
Right.
The government's goal is to target those schools and get them up to a C grade, right? I mean, it's a relatively modest proposal here, right? To get them into essentially get everything into a passing grade, not actually do anything meaningful.
We're not shooting for the
This is like
stars
remove
here.
the mold is
Yes.
the standard
Yeah,
here. Okay.
exactly. We're going to take a quick break, gentlemen. Paul, just hold that thought. We'll be back with more on our panel talking about the Quebec provincial budget right after this. Don't go anywhere.
Well, if there's no increase in income taxes, that's a good thing. But I want to know what's behind it. How do they get there? What are they going to offer? Are they going to cut something else?
There's no increases, but I'm sure there's a catch somewhere in other things.
Because you need to look at the whole thing. You need to see where the money's going in each department.
It's a long-term investment. We have to consider and we have to take the proper decisions. So hopefully the government will do.
So happy, but I'm not sure what it means in terms of like the overall budget.
More benefits, so it's a fantastic news.
It makes a big difference. So we wish that every kid would have a chance for a good start in life and a good care. So it's good, yeah.
Well, they certainly seem to be pleased when it comes to the provincial budget that was just laid out yesterday. And joining us on the panel, we have Suanne Stein Day. She's the chairperson of the Lester B. Pearson School Board. Welcome to the show, Suanne. It's a pleasure having you in this second half. We actually ended our conversation in the first half talking about education. We wanted to start with you and get your perspective on what you thought about the budget as far as education dollars go.
Well, I talked with Minister Leteo on Monday night, and he promised me it couldn't be worse than last year. And he's absolutely right. It's a whole bunch better than last year, and for that we're grateful. It's not the $7 billion that's going into transportation,
right?
But $500 million investment this year. One has to realize that that's across the province, and that doesn't translate the same way to each school board. As the largest English school board, we get about $1.25 million of that.
Right.
So smaller boards are getting even less.
Sorry, go ahead, Elias.
Your board is looking at closing schools. They're going to close schools.
Yes.
What would you need to not close schools?
Students.
That's the
biggest
issue for you.
registration is your
Absolutely.
biggest challenge at the moment.
Absolutely.
Were you surprised to see where the dollars were going as far as education is concerned?
Well, to some extent, yes, because one thing I've been talking to these governments about, to subsequent ministers of education, is not to keep allocating these small amounts of monies to each segment. We're going to get province-wide $1 million towards early literacy. That translates to about $25,000 to my school board. That's less than half a person year. Give me the money. Let me allocate it where I need best, because every school board is different. I won't see a lot of that infrastructure money because we've been proactive. Our schools are in pretty good shape. There's no school that needs to be ripped down to be rebuilt.
I think you hear this perspective a lot, no matter whether it's education, healthcare is probably the same perspective, Paul. Would you like to see that same idea that Suanne is talking about when it comes to healthcare?
And one of the good ideas that the minister had is that he's trying to define what is the real cost of any given healthcare, so that every hospital should be standardizing their costs so that we have the same. Because like you're saying, if someone is paying more, or if in a given hospital the costs are too high, eventually the state would finance that kind of cost, and we're trying to lower it and equalize it to a certain extent. I'm not sure that, like you're saying, every hospital in every region has the same cost figure, and for that matter, we shouldn't be modulating the cost of any given healthcare service, because it's not the same thing as infrastructure, of course.
My biggest fear is that education gets homogenized, because I'm telling you, students in different regions, in different schools, even within the same school, students need different things to meet their individual needs. If we want success rates to go up, we have to meet the needs of each student, not all students.
Let's move on to paying off the debt. Phil, you touched on it a little bit earlier. Tell us, your opinion on this $2 billion. Could it have been better served to use a portion of that $2 billion elsewhere?
Well, if we look at the money that traditionally goes to the Fonds de Génération, like last year was about $1.5 billion, and in previous years it was much lower than that. 10 years ago it was $584 million, right? So there's been a massive growth in terms of what goes to pay the debt, and the point of that is to get the debt GDP ratio down from where it is right now, right? It peaked about 5 years ago at 57%, and now it's down to about 55%. Now, the problem with just sort of throwing money at the debt is that your debt to GDP ratio is going to shrink regardless, just from the economy growing, right? And by just throwing massive amounts of money at it, you're not actually having the political debate of whether that money could be invested elsewhere. I mean, could we have put $1.8 billion towards the debt and reversed, say, the cutbacks to early childhood education, right? That was $164 million. It's a fairly piddling sum, right, in comparison to what we're talking about here. So what it does is it takes that political debate of where to spend the money right off the table by saying, well, there's no money to talk about in the first place.
Elias, are you also saying here that really what the focus should be is on growing the economy? Because if you grow the GDP of Quebec, you're really taking care of the debt in a much more effective manner?
I'm saying it's worth talking about. I'm saying the question needs to be asked, right? You can't just take that question off the table.
So that's one thing that was disappointing yesterday. I don't think we saw enough about fixing Quebec's unemployment rates.
Yes.
Getting this economy moving again, because if this economy is moving, more people are moving to Quebec, maybe that means more students for your board, that means more money in the healthcare system, and that I think is concerning for me.
Well, perhaps the PQ had a point when they're talking, where are those 250,000 jobs that were promised back in 2014? Paul, you want to
Political promises. I mean, if you go back to 40 or even 20 years now that I've been a spokesperson, we've heard and we're told so many things, but the money doesn't follow the promises, and that's the problem. Especially in healthcare, we shouldn't be confronted to a political head, but rather have something more independent from political promises, because as we speak now, we have a lot of demand. You know, people are asking and demanding because things have been cut. And I'm being told, that's new in our business, we're being told, Mr. Brunet, we're going to equalize everything. We need everyone to get something. But nobody is getting enough. But they're all getting something which is insufficient. That's the new trend I hear.
What about business? We mentioned economy. I mean, entrepreneurs, small business, they're the real engine of any economy. Was there enough for small businesses in this provincial budget?
Well, I mean, there was more that went to economic investment and small businesses than there was to education, which for an education budget probably tells you quite a bit. But the truth is that the government has a limited capacity in terms of what it can do, right? I mean, it's going to be right now what the economy is suffering from is the oil shock. It's the low Canadian dollar, which is helping exports, but hurting other investments. I mean, those macroeconomic questions. There's not much the government can do about it. It's why those figures like the 250,000 jobs and created, I mean, they're pulled out of thin air, right? I mean, the Liberals promised 250 because the CAQ promised 225, and because you know what I mean. It's hard to judge a government by those specific promises because they're not based on anything, right? And so the government of Quebec is not able to actually do a whole lot for those macroeconomic conditions that would have an actual effect. So whether they're throwing good money after bad it's probably not the case, but it's certainly they're not going to do a whole lot.
Well, we're certainly all looking forward to the federal budget being rolled out next week. We'll probably have our panel, I'm sure, on that coming up next week. Thanks to all of you. Suanne, a pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much for coming. Phil, Paul, thank you for being here as well. Of course, my colleague, Elias.